Baldwin. Today I'm going to be reviewing with you guys Unit 4 Monetary Policy. The focus of my lesson is mainly going to be on the federal fund rate. And before we get into that, we're going to have to cover some terms in order for you to be able to complete an example problem by the end of this lesson. The first thing that we're going to have to go over is the federal fund rate. The federal fund rate is the rate that banks borrow from each other. Now, despite its name, it actually has nothing to do with the Federal Reserve banking system. The only time it does is when the Federal Reserve Bank buys or sells bonds. If that is the case, then we're dealing with expansionary and contractionary policies. Now, that sometimes only applies to monetary policy and fiscal policy. The difference between monetary and fiscal policy is that when you're dealing with monetary policy, you're dealing with the selling and buying of bonds and a lot of open market operations. When you're dealing with fiscal policy, you're mainly just dealing with government spending and taxing. So what does that have to do with what we're doing? Expansionary is also known as tight money, and contractionary is known as easy money. So now that you have some terms, I'm going to try to apply it to this example problem. So the problem says, assume that open market operation that you indicated in part B is equal to 10 billion. If the required reserve ratio is 0.2, calculate the maximum change in loans throughout the banking system. So in this problem, the open market operation that we're going to be used is called the selling of bonds. When you're selling bonds, it means that you're in an inflation period. Thank you, Miss Lena. You're dealing with inflation. When you're dealing with inflation, you're going to be dealing with a contractionary policy, which means that the interest rate's going to go higher, inflation's going to be up, and you're going to be trying to counteract that. So in this problem, you're going to take the required ratio of 0.2, and you're going to multiply it by 10 billion. That's going to give you 2 billion. That 2 billion is going to become your required reserves. Required reserves is the amount of money that a bank must have in their bank at all times. So in case something bad happens, they have something to back it up. So in order to get your excess reserves, you're going to want to subtract the required reserves minus your 10 billion. Your 10 billion is also known as your checkable deposits. Your checkable deposits is also known as your liabilities, and your liabilities and your assets, it can also be formed in a T-chart. These always have to be equal. So now that you know that they have to be equal, in order to get your excess reserves, you're going to take 10 minus 2, and you're going to get 8 billion. That 8 billion then becomes your excess reserves. It's 8 billion. No, it's 8 billion. I was right. 8 billion. That 8 billion is going to be your maximum change in loans throughout the banking system. Maximum change. So I think the best way to show what this does to the change in the money supply is by drawing on a graph. The best way to do this is by drawing money market graphs. In money market graphs, you're always going to have the interest rate on your vertical axis and your key money on your horizontal axis. And your demand is always going to be downward sloping. And then your supply, since it's not affected by the Federal Reserve System, is always going to be vertical. However, it is going to shift depending on the policy that you're using. So, for example, in the selling of bonds, you're going to be selling bonds, which is getting rid of your money supply. So the money supply is going to go from S1, and it's going to shift left, which is decreasing. Your demand isn't going to change, and your new interest rate should be about right here, which is high, which just is a prime example of how this is an example of a contractionary policy. Okay, so another way to illustrate this is by saying what would happen if inflation was to get higher. What would happen to the interest rate? If inflation was to raise, it would go back to exactly what I said earlier. The Federal Reserve would start to sell bonds to try to decrease the interest rate. However, the exact opposite would happen. It would still be S1 decrease to the left, which would be S2, and the interest rate would still be high because of inflation.